Thank you, Bishop, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you all for being here. When I had completed my address to this august body about a year ago, and I had said that in the United Methodist Church, there isn't any level of our operation at which we were going to restructure ourselves out of our difficulties, our bishop asked me a very important question. He wanted to know, if structure isn't the problem, what is? My answer, you'll recall, was a parallel to the answer of what's important in real estate matters. I said there are three things we need to get right in the church to get the church focused on its dual mission of making disciples and transforming the world. And those three are leadership, leadership, and leadership. Now that's a bit like the situation Jesus faced when a lawyer came to him and asked, in Luke's version of the story, what he had to do to inherit eternal life. In return, Jesus asked him what the Torah says. And the lawyer said, in short, it says, love God and love neighbor. To which Jesus famously told the story of the Good Samaritan, ending with full agreement that the one who showed mercy was the neighbor. It's a whole lot easier and probably more instructive to tell a story to show what a neighbor is than to give a complex definition detached from experience. The story gives the answer. Leadership, in my judgment, is to some degree at least the same kind of thing. We think we know what it is when we see it, though it isn't always easy to define exactly what constitutes being a leader. Now, I've told you before, I'm not a preacher, I'm a Sunday school teacher, so that means you're going to get a Sunday school lesson. We're often surprised by who turns out to be a leader, aren't we? I've just read a relatively new novel by Barbara Kingsolver called Flight Behavior, in which one of the characters, Bobby Ogle, the unlikeliest person in town, became the charismatic preacher and leader of the largest church in the county. But we don't have to go to fiction to find some of the most compelling stories about leaders, many of whom were unlikely, as seen from the point of view of their contemporaries, or even in some cases, in retrospect. The one on whom I want to focus right now fits both those criteria. She was unlikely to her contemporaries, at least in the society where fate or God, take your pick, placed her to live and hold sway. Or to most of people in the thousands of generations who have followed her. If you haven't read the book Jezebel, The Untold Story of the Bible's Harlot Queen by Leslie Hazelton, you need to remedy that deficiency. In my judgment, this is one of the most important, popular, and accessible works of historical critical Bible scholarship in a generation. I will immodestly tell you that I had formulated, both in my head and somewhat on paper, much of the thesis that Hazelton develops in this book before she published. But she beat me into print with it, so now I don't have to write the book. How do we know that Jezebel was a figure of history and not just a creature of the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings, who needed somebody to serve as a foil for the exploits of Elijah and Elisha? Well, we can't be certain because she's not otherwise attested. But there was no need for the author to create Jezebel because he already had Ahab, who is otherwise attested. More importantly, one of the tests of historicity in the historical critical method is embarrassment. And if she was anything, Jezebel was an embarrassment, not only to the author of Kings, but to the entire Davidic establishment in the southern kingdom of Judah. She was so much of an embarrassment that the author of the Chronicles wrote her out of the story entirely. The rationale goes that if Jezebel were not so strongly present in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, the author of Kings would also have written her out of his story. To understand the kind of leader that this ill-fated woman was, we need to know a bit about the kind of person she married. But I hasten to add that this is not at all to say that Jezebel's stature was dependent on Ahab, or that she was in any sycophantic way subservient to Ahab. Jezebel was a towering person of her time on her own strength and merit, as I'll demonstrate for you. What the Old Testament writers want us to understand is that the zenith of Israelite political and military power and influence came at the time of Solomon, solely and directly because of the leadership and divine favor bestowed on Solomon's father and mentor, David. David's remembered and extolled as the ideal of what a king should be. And any future hope for restoration of power and influence is based on a hope for restoration of the Davidic line. Christians inherited this hope, and all the early Christian writers cast Jesus as a scion of the line of David. Some scholars tell us that the whole reason for the writing of the Chronicles was to bolster David's stature. But a careful reading of the biblical texts tells a different story as the truth leaks through the cracks. And the alternative story is powerfully supported by the archaeology. We can be reasonably certain that the zenith of power and influence of the Israelite people until modern times was during the time of the house of Omri. And the most effective ruler of the house of Omri was Ahab, Omri's son and successor. That was not a comfortable truth for the historians of the southern kingdom. And they are, of course, the historians who had the final editorial word. They survived for almost 200 years longer than the northern kingdom, and their exile was a relatively brief period. And it was during the time of the exile, and shortly thereafter, that this stuff was shaped into the final form almost exclusively by these survivors of the southern kingdom. They hated Jezebel. They hated Jezebel to the point that you can literally see their joy as they relate the final episode in her life when she is literally turned into dog shit after being thrown out of the window by her servants. But that's to jump too hastily to the end. Jezebel was a princess before she was a queen. She was the favored and much honored daughter of one of the most powerful monarchs of her time, Ethbaal, king of Tyre. She was a Phoenician, and in a brilliant political move for both sides, Jezebel was given in marriage to Ahab, king of Israel. Their wedding is almost certainly the one celebrated in Psalm 45. Hear, O daughter, consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. Since he is your Lord, bow down to him. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people, with all kinds of wealth. The princess is decked in her chamber with gold-woven robes. In many-colored robes she is led to the king. Behind her the virgins, her companions, follow. With joy and gladness they are led along as they enter the palace of the king. In the place of ancestors, you, O king, shall have sons. You will make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be celebrated in all generations. Therefore the peoples will praise you forever and ever. The claim that the author of Kings makes about Ahab to the effect that he, quote, went and served Baal and worshipped him, rings really hollow. we know the names of two of Ahab's sons, because each became in turn king after him. One was named Ahaziah, which means Yahweh has grasped. And the other was named Jehoram, which means Yahweh is high. What Ahab almost certainly did do was accommodate the religion of his most important wife, Jezebel, by allowing her to bring into the kingdom her priests and the trappings of the Phoenician faith, the many gods of the cult of Baal. The meaning of her name is distorted because it comes to us through the Hebrew. But in her language, it probably meant God is Baal, a terrifically honorific name that testified to her status with her father and thus with the people of her origin. But Jezebel's status as a leader isn't solely dependent on what we can piece together from her Phoenician origin, because somewhat inadvertently, the author of Kings tells us much more. The most famous scene from the Jezebel story comes when Elijah, that mysterious non-writing prophet of Yahweh, challenges the prophets of Baal to a showdown at the OK Corral. In what might be the most infamous story on record of religious intolerance, after Yahweh wins the shootout and turns Elijah's sacrificial animals into toast, Elijah then had the priests of Baal rounded up and killed at the river. Word of that got to Jezebel by none other than the mouth of King Ahab, since the dead priests were almost certainly the attendants that Jezebel had brought with her from Tyre. So her reaction was to send a messenger to Elijah, throwing down the gauntlet. The message is a little bit unclear, as you can tell from reading many translations. Unless you know the Hebrew, you can read it for yourself. You can see from all these translations that we don't know exactly for certain what she said, but the translation that I like best comes directly from the Septuagint, which is rendered into English and says something like the following. And why most of our translations translate this differently, I don't know, but they're just wrong. If you are God is Yahweh, I am God is Baal, and by this time tomorrow one of us is going to be dead. That is, of course, a wordplay on the names of both of the characters in this drama. God is Yahweh is what Elijah means. God is Baal is what Jezebel meant in her first language. The thing most important to remember is that Elijah is a prophet of Yahweh who has essentially unlimited access to the monarchy. He comfortably moves in and out of the presence of the king. At one point, Ahab asked him, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" And Jezebel is a woman. Well, Elijah did what any sane person would do at that point, I expect. As you know, he ran as fast and as far as his legs would carry him. The next scene in which we see Jezebel is, from our perspective, not perhaps her finest hour, but from the perspective of her time and the two cultures in which she lived, which is to say, in which the monarch wielded absolute power and owned everything in the land. We see Jezebel doing what it took to secure for Ahab a vineyard that he craved for his own but didn't know exactly how to obtain. That Naboth, who owned it, had to die in the transaction was a small price in the reckoning of the time. Jezebel was doing what she thought was required to serve her husband, her king, and her adopted country, which in fact in her thinking and in the thinking of virtually everyone of her time was represented in the person of one man, Ahab. And it was Jezebel who took the lead. Within the next few years, Ahab made an alliance with Judah and was killed in battle against the foreign enemy of both Israel and Judah. Ahab was succeeded in rapid succession on the throne by two of his sons. First, Ahaziah, and then Jehoram, or Joram as it's sometimes pronounced. We're told that Ahaziah and Joram were sons of Jezebel, which once again proves the power of her leadership in the household, since in 2 Kings 10:1 we're told that Ahab had 70 sons. It's unlikely that Jezebel had 70 sons. In the final drama of her life, Jezebel witnessed from afar one of her son, Joram's generals, treacherously kill him and march on the city of Samaria, the capital of the kingdom. Like a true and valiant leader, now without power or influence and nothing left but her own personal resources, she put on her finest clothes, decorated her body with her finest jewels, and defiantly went and sat in the window to greet Jehu, the usurper, upon his arrival. This is probably the most misinterpreted act in the entire Bible. The common way this has been read is to read it as though Jezebel were doing that to tempt Jehu into a relationship and prolonging her own reign. Humbug. She was much too thoroughly enamored to do that. And what she says to Jehu makes it abundantly clear. She said, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" You can understand that best if you hear it as, "Is it to be peace, Benedict Arnold, you who have murdered your own master?" She got exactly what she had expected to get. Jehu appealed to those with her inside to throw her out of the window, which they did. She was killed in the fall, and though Jehu commanded that she be treated honorably in death, calling her a king's daughter, she was left to die there in the chaos where the dogs ate her corpse. Would the final story of Israel's fate have been different if Ahab and Jezebel had lived out their lives to the full and not died violently? We'll never know, but that's unlikely. What we do know is that following their deaths, both Israel and tiny Judah, tiny dependent Judah, declined steadily, eventually to disappear from history until modern times. What has been the lasting legacy of Jezebel and of Ahab? Is there any? Herman Melville thought so. Remember the name of the captain of the Pequod? Ahab. Sure. Ahab lives on, at least in that sense, among us today. When I was a kid, there was a popular song by Frankie Lane. Jezebel, if ever a devil was born, without a pair of horns, it was you. Jezebel, it was you. Deceiving me, grieving me, leaving me blue. Jezebel, it was you. Ever heard that? Some of you have. Yeah. Was that it for Jezebel? Did you disappear forever from that? Well, probably not. One of the most powerful and influential monarchs of modern times was named after Jezebel. Although the name was morphed a little bit, but it's the same name. Isabella, Queen of Spain. North America was discovered by Europeans, at least in part as a result of Isabella's influence. So we know that the name survives, even though it is unlikely that anybody is going to name their kid Jezebel because of the misinterpretation of the legacy of Jezebel. If I'd had a daughter, I would have attempted to name her Jezebel, but I suspect my wife wouldn't have let me do that. A whole lot depends on leadership. And it often comes from quarters and in forms that we don't expect. Thank you.